Tonight we slip into the cool hush of the jungle at midnight, torches spitting little sparks as you make your way down a steep stone stairway. The smell of damp earth and roots lingers in your nose, heavy and musky, and every step feels like it could drop you into the open mouth of some waiting jaguar god. You're about to enter the burial chamber of a Mayan king, a place meant for royal bones and secret treasures. Honestly, you probably won't survive this kind of midnight tomb crawl in real life, but hey, lucky for you, you're just listening from your bed. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You crouch under the low lintel, brush away cobwebs thick enough to make you question your life choices, and there it is, a tomb sealed for centuries, now yawning open. The air is stale, like a cupboard no one dared to open since forever, tinged with something sweet: resin, incense, maybe even cacao dust that somehow clung to the air like ghost perfume. You point your torch, and murals flicker to life on the plaster. Jaguars prowling under celestial glyphs, kings striding in feathered cloaks, and scattered among them, painted cacao pods, fat, ribbed, golden brown. It's a surreal mashup of art and afterlife travel brochure. The Mayans weren't kidding around with their tomb decor. These weren't just memorial basements, they were entire cosmological maps. Think of it like being buried with your phone, your charger, your Wi-Fi router, and your favorite Spotify playlist, except instead of pixels, everything's painted in reds, blues, and deep greens, lined with delicate black ink. The king wasn't just lying in the dirt, he was staged to continue living, ruling, and sipping in another realm. You step closer, and your sandal crunches over something on the ground. Not gold, not jade, though those are here too, scattered like dropped candy, but tiny, shriveled beans, once plump and fragrant. Cacao. The very same stuff that, after centuries of human obsession, has turned into your chocolate bars and mocha frappes. Here, though, it meant way more than a midnight snack. These beans were a passport, a bribe, a ritual, a memory. To be buried with cacao was to be armed with currency and flavor for eternity. The torch smoke curls above your head, and the flame trembles, making the painted cacao pods on the wall seem to ripple as if growing before your eyes. You almost swear you can hear the rustle of leaves, maybe even the plop of a ripe pod falling to earth. Historians still argue whether the Mayans saw cacao as food first or symbol first. Was it fuel for daily life, or a plant grown purely for its sacred charge? Either way, the dead king wasn't taking chances. He wanted beans tucked at his side, as essential as the jade mask covering his face. Picture this king in life. He's reclining on a woven mat, a servant frothing a spiced cacao drink in a tall ceramic cup, pouring it back and forth until it foams like a cappuccino. He takes a sip, thick, bitter, maybe flavored with chili or honey, and claims he drinks the very lifeblood of gods. Now imagine him dead, sealed in stone, expecting that same drink waiting in the afterlife, like a cosmic barista station hidden somewhere past the stars. No matter what came next, he'd be ready. And honestly, can you blame him? If you had the chance to pack your afterlife luggage, you'd probably throw in snacks too. Maybe not bitter frothy cacao unless you're into that, but Doritos? Definitely. Energy drinks? For sure. An eternal pillow? Yes, please. The Mayan king wasn't so different. He just chose what his culture said was divine, powerful, and prestigious. The murals stare down at you now, those jaguars with mouths open wide, birds with jeweled tails, and between them, cacao pods, unmistakable. They almost look like punctuation marks, dotting the sentences of his afterlife story. Each pod is a reminder, you'll need this. Like post-it notes for eternity, except gilded and painted. A bead of sweat drips down your forehead. It's hot in here, heavy with the weight of centuries. You imagine the moment of burial itself, priests chanting, incense curling, jade rattling in the dark, and carefully, almost tenderly, someone slipping cacao beans into the folds of the funerary bundle. Maybe they whispered words to guide the king's spirit. Maybe they believed each bean was a seed of rebirth, promising his soul would sprout again like a tree after rain. And you, standing here centuries later, can almost hear the faint murmur of that ritual. The cacao, long dead and dried, still carries that whisper. You lean against the rough limestone wall, torch crackling, and your eyes fall again on those shriveled little cacao beans scattered at your feet. At first glance, they look like nothing, just ancient leftovers, the kind of thing you'd sweep out of a corner and forget. But here, in this tomb, they were as valuable as rubies. To the Maya, cacao wasn't just food, it was sacred currency, a direct gift from the gods. Imagine being told that a tree in the forest bore seeds that could connect you to divine forces. That's how the Mayans treated cacao. According to their myths, it was Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god, who first gifted humans with the plant. He brought it down from paradise, like the ultimate care package. You, standing here now, can almost picture villagers roasting cacao beans, grinding them with stones, and mixing them with water until a thick, dark, bitter brew steamed in the air. That drink wasn't about sweetness, it was about ceremony, about plugging your very soul into something cosmic. And the kings? They took it further. A cup of cacao was a throne in liquid form. To sip was to prove your closeness to the gods. They didn't hand this stuff out at birthday parties, it was elite, carefully guarded, meant for ceremonies and high-ranking feasts. So when a king died, slipping cacao beans into his tomb was a way of saying, "Here you go, still a VIP, even beyond the grave." Now pause for a second and imagine how weird this looks from today's perspective. You're standing in a royal tomb where the most precious offering wasn't just gold or jade, but something you could technically roast and drink. It's like burying someone with a stash of Starbucks gift cards. Funny, yes, but also telling. Cacao was wealth, privilege, and connection. Every bean carried the weight of ritual, like a portable offering to the gods. The air feels warmer the longer you stand here, and you can almost smell that ancient brew, smoky, earthy, with hints of chili and honey. It's not a comforting hot chocolate, it's more like drinking thunder in a cup. Historians still argue whether the Maya prized the flavor itself or simply the ritual around it. After all, we know the original drink wasn't sugary sweet, it was foamy, bitter, sometimes spiced until it practically punched your tongue. But to the Maya, the froth on top was the crown. They poured it from vessel to vessel until it frothed high, like the heavens themselves bubbling to life. Here's a quirky tidbit. Cacao beans were sometimes used as actual money. You could buy a rabbit with about 10 beans, or hire a porter for one day with roughly 2. Imagine carrying around a little pouch of what we'd consider chocolate coins, only these weren't foil-wrapped treats, they were the real economic system. So, for a king to take beans into his tomb, it wasn't just sacred, it was practical. Eternal shopping money, in case the underworld charged admission. The murals reinforce that sense of sacredness. Look closer, and you notice the way cacao pods are painted not just as fruit but almost as glowing symbols. They're nestled next to jaguars, divine birds, and celestial glyphs, as if the artists wanted to say, cacao belongs right here, alongside cosmic powers. You run your hand lightly over the plaster, and the grooves remind you how many hours, how many hands, went into these walls. Every brushstroke carried a prayer, every pigment mixed with intention. And let's not forget the role of priests. In ceremonies, they'd grind the beans, mix them, chant over the vessels, and present the drink with carefully chosen words. Sometimes cacao was mixed with blood, a drop from the tongue or ear of the sacrificer, because, well, what's more divine than mixing godly drink with human life force? Don't worry, you don't have to taste it tonight. But in this tomb, knowing that possibility, you realize how deeply sacred every bean really was. You crouch down, Pick up one of those dried remains, and roll it between your fingers. It's brittle, fragile, but once upon a time, it was a symbol of continuity, a passport through death. You wonder, did the king's family weep as they placed it there? Or did they smile knowingly, trusting the gods would welcome him with a foamy cup? And here's the kicker, even now, archaeologists find chemical traces of cacao in the residues of pots buried with kings. Imagine scraping the inside of a 1,200-year-old cup and realizing it still whispers of chocolate. That's the kind of discovery that sends modern scientists bouncing with excitement like kids in a candy shop, except their candy is dust. So as you stand here, surrounded by beans and murals, you start to grasp the magnitude. Cacao wasn't trivial. It was a sacred key, a divine bribe, a fragrant reminder that even in death, the king had access to cosmic drinks no ordinary villager could ever dream of. And you, intruding centuries later, get to see the echoes of that reverence lingering in the shadows. The air in the tomb grows heavier, pressing on your chest as though reminding you that you're intruding on something sacred. You shift your torch to another stretch of wall, and there it is again, a mural where cacao pods dangle like ornaments from a tree. But this time, they're painted alongside maize, tall stalks rising beside the pods as if the two were partners. And they were. In Mayan thought, maize was the substance of human flesh, and cacao was the lifeblood that gave energy and richness to existence. Together, they told the story of kingship itself. You trace a line across the mural with your eyes, a king standing tall, maize stalks curling behind him, cacao pods clustered near his feet. The message is clear, he isn't just ruling people, he's embodying crops. He's maize because he sustains his subjects, feeding them, embodying the very body of humanity. But he's also cacao, the luxury, the divine flavor, the ceremonial heart. In life, he straddled both roles, and in death, he carried that double identity into the afterlife. Now here's a mainstream historical fact that might surprise you. The Popol Vuh, the sacred Maya text, describes humans as being fashioned out of maize dough. Not wheat, not rice, maize. It's their origin story, their Genesis chapter, carved in corn. So, when rulers proclaimed themselves as maize kings, they were basically saying, I'm literally the stuff you're made of. Humble? Not so much. But effective? Absolutely. And to add cacao into that royal branding, that meant, I'm not just your flesh, I'm the divine drink that connects you to the gods. Historians still argue whether cacao's role in kingship was more symbolic than literal. Some suggest rulers staged elaborate cacao feasts purely to dazzle and impress, while others argue the symbolism ran so deep that the king himself was thought to sprout like a cacao tree in mythic rebirth cycles. Either way, the blend of maize and cacao was no accident, it was a carefully curated identity package. Now imagine this in action, a royal court ceremony, drums thudding, incense smoking, a line of servants carrying tall painted vessels brimming with cacao froth. The king lifts his cup high, maize motifs painted on his cloak, cacao glyphs etched onto his jewelry, and the crowd gasps. In that moment, he's not just drinking, he's embodying divine balance. It's like watching someone sip espresso while wearing a crown made of pizza crust, except infinitely more serious and sacred. A quirky tidbit slips in here too. In some depictions, cacao pods are shown sprouting directly from the king's body, like botanical accessories. Imagine your boss walking into work with avocados growing out of their elbows. Strange? Yes. Symbolic? Absolutely. For the Maya, those sprouting pods declared fertility, prosperity, and a literal link to divine agriculture. The king wasn't just farming land, he was the land. You crouch lower, peering at a broken pottery shard near the burial mat. Its painted design shows a cacao tree twining upward, roots spreading beneath, branches stretching above. Right at the center, a royal face peers out, half human, half plant. The idea hits you. This isn't just art. This was political propaganda, eternal branding. In life and in death, rulers advertised themselves as the crops that kept the world turning. And cacao, the indulgent, sacred bean, made that image taste even sweeter or more bitter, depending on the mix. And let's be honest, you'd probably do the same. If you had to brand yourself with foods, wouldn't you pick a combination? Maybe you're part pizza, sustenance, comfort, and part coffee, divine energy, sacred addiction. The king did just that, only with maize and cacao, and the result still stuns you centuries later. The torchlight flickers again, and your shadow stretches long against the wall. You imagine the king's funeral, his body painted, wrapped, adorned, surrounded by maize kernels and cacao beans. Priests chant, villagers bring offerings, musicians pound drums that echo like thunder. And in that moment, everyone believes they are sending not just a man but a crop god hybrid into the underworld. He won't just travel, he'll sprout, blossom, and rise again. The symbolism swells around you until it feels almost alive. The beans at your feet, the murals on the wall, the painted shards scattered across the floor, they all hum with the same message. This king wasn't ordinary. He was maize, he was cacao, he was the eternal cycle of life and death. And in burying him with those beans, his people weren't just honoring him, they were planting him, like a seed meant to grow again in realms unseen. Your torch crackles low, throwing long shadows across the chamber, and you picture the king lying there, wrapped in cloth, with vessels of cacao placed close to his hands. Not just beans this time, ceramic jars still faintly stained with what once foamed inside. If maize was the flesh and bones, cacao was the drink of the spirit, meant to be sipped in the afterlife just as in life. The Mayans weren't burying a ruler with a snack pack, they were packing his cosmic thermos. You squat near a painted vessel, its rim chipped but the decoration still sharp. Two jaguars prowl around the side, their tails curling like question marks, and above them, glyphs that translate to something along the lines of divine cacao. It hits you. This jar wasn't just for decoration. It was a tool, a promise that even after death, the king could pour himself a steaming cup of the foamy, bitter brew that had fueled his ceremonies in life. Here's a mainstream fact. Cacao was prepared as a hot or sometimes cold drink, whipped into a froth by pouring it back and forth between vessels. That froth was considered the best part, the crown of the drink. Priests compared it to the foam of the sea or the froth of clouds, the liminal spaces between worlds. So when you sip it, you weren't just drinking, you were swallowing the edge of heaven. Imagine thinking your cappuccino foam is literally the Milky Way, no pressure on the barista, right? Historians still argue whether these afterlife drinks were intended for the king alone or for the ancestors waiting to welcome him. Some suggest the vessels were offerings to the spirits, not just provisions for the dead. Either way, the idea of liquid travel rations is striking. The king wasn't going to wander the underworld parched, he was armed with a drink so sacred it blurred the line between food and prayer. And here's your quirky tidbit. Some Mayan recipes mixed cacao with maize gruel, creating a thick, filling drink that was part sustenance, part ritual. Think of it as the original smoothie, half breakfast, half ceremony. That means the king's tomb might have contained the equivalent of ancient protein shakes, fueling him for eternal workouts across the starry road of the afterlife. As you look closer at the murals, you notice scenes of feasting, lords and nobles lifting tall cups, their lips rimmed with froth. These aren't images of gluttony, they're snapshots of cosmic communion. Drinking cacao wasn't about quenching thirst, it was about joining a chain of ancestors, gods, and rulers who all shared the same divine substance. The tomb captures that expectation. In death, the king would keep sipping, keep communing, keep ruling. You let your mind drift, imagining what it would taste like if you could somehow lift one of these jars and take a sip. Bitter, sharp, maybe laced with chili until it burned your throat, then smoothed by honey. Not the cozy hot chocolate you curl up with on rainy nights, but a drink that slaps you awake and whispers, "Pay attention. The gods are watching." And you realize how carefully all of this was staged. The tomb isn't random clutter. Every vessel, every bean, every mural is a playlist of sorts, a ritual sequence to ensure the king doesn't just stumble into the afterlife but struts in, cup in hand, froth clinging to his lip, ready to take his place among celestial beings. The torch sputters for a moment, and in that flicker, you picture the burial scene itself. Priests chanting, smoke swirling, attendants carefully pouring fresh cacao into the jars before sealing them in the tomb. The drink probably steamed in the cool air, a last sensory gift for the dead. Maybe the aroma itself was thought to guide the king's soul, a fragrant beacon drawing him toward paradise. And you, standing centuries later in the dark, you catch a phantom whiff of it, bittersweet, heavy with history. It's like walking into a kitchen long after the meal is gone, still catching the ghost of spices clinging to the air. You can almost hear the liquid splash as it's poured, almost see the froth rising. The tomb breathes with memory, and the king, though long dust, still waits with his eternal cup. You shift your torch and notice something you missed before, a small woven pouch tucked near the king's side, long rotted but leaving behind a scatter of cacao beans across the stone floor. You kneel down, brush the dust away, and realize you're staring at an ancient wallet. Not filled with coins, but beans. Because here's the twist, in the Mayan world, cacao wasn't just sacred drink, it was actual money. Mainstream fact first, cacao beans were widely used as currency in Mesoamerica. A rabbit could cost about 10 beans. A turkey hen? Roughly 100. You could hire a porter for 2 beans a day. It's hard not to smile as you imagine people jingling pouches of cacao beans instead of coins. Imagine losing your wallet and watching someone snack on your life savings. Ouch. Now, why bury them in a tomb? Because the underworld wasn't free. Mayan belief described Xibalba, a realm full of lords who demanded respect, tributes, and maybe even tolls. So slipping beans into a king's grave was like tucking cab fare into his pocket payment for whatever spirit gatekeepers he might meet. Historians still argue whether this underworld currency was literal or metaphorical. Was the king meant to bribe deities, or were the beans symbolic of his worldly power carried into death? Either way, no one wanted him wandering broke. Here's your quirky tidbit. There are Spanish accounts of cacao counterfeiting. Some sneaky folks hollowed out the shells, stuffed them with dirt, and passed them off as the real deal. Counterfeit chocolate coins, which means if the king's beans had been swapped out for fakes, his afterlife shopping spree might have ended badly. Luckily, tomb beans were sacred, so priests likely checked their authenticity with care. You lean back, torchlight glinting on a ceramic jar with glyphs for tribute. It dawns on you, this chamber wasn't just a pantry, it was a bank vault. Each bin doubled as a spiritual coin and a cosmic seed, a 2-in-1 investment plan for eternity. The king's people clearly believed that when he crossed into Xibalba, he'd need more than courage, he'd need currency. Picture it. The king arrives in the shadowy afterlife, jaguar gods snarling, skeletal lords demanding tribute. He reaches into his funerary pouch, hands over a few cacao beans, and is allowed to pass. Smooth operator. It's almost funny, imagining eternity functioning like a cosmic toll road, but it also underscores how practical and spiritual blurred for the Maya. Cacao was both daily money and divine key. You run your fingers over one bin left intact, dry, cracked, featherlight. Once, this was worth a meal, a servant's day, maybe even the peace of a soul. Now it's just brittle dust in your palm. Still, its echo of value lingers, humming with centuries of meaning. And here's where the humor sneaks in. Imagine you could time travel, pockets full of modern chocolate bars. You'd either be hailed as the richest ruler of them all or instantly robbed and sacrificed for your sugary stash. Either way, you wouldn't last 5 minutes in a Mayan marketplace. The torch smoke curls upward, and your eyes follow it to the murals again. Beans are painted not just as food, but as neat little clusters that look suspiciously like stacks of coins. Suddenly, the tomb feels less like a grave and more like a treasury, each bin a golden coin of memory, payment, and power. The king lies wrapped nearby, and you can almost hear his voice, "I won't go empty-handed." And indeed, he won't. His afterlife is bankrolled, his spiritual wallet full. Whether it's bribes for gods, gifts for ancestors, or simply a reminder of his earthly wealth, those beans ensure he crosses into eternity as he lived in abundance. The air grows cooler the deeper you wander into the chamber, and suddenly the scattered beans on the floor look less like coins and more like seeds. You pause, letting the idea sink in. Seeds of rebirth, that's what the Maya saw in Cacao. Each bin wasn't just money or drink, it was a tiny promise that life always circles back. Mainstream fact: cacao trees were linked in Mayan cosmology to cycles of fertility and renewal. Pods sprouted directly from the trunk, an unusual trait that fascinated ancient farmers. To them, it looked like life springing straight from the body of the tree, effortless and abundant. So burying Cacao with a king wasn't just practical, it was symbolic of his own rebirth in another realm. You lean down and hold one of the brittle husks in your palm, imagining it fresh and glossy, planted in soil. In life, this king ruled fields and villages. In death, he too would be planted, his body like a seed in the earth, his tomb like fertile ground. With Cacao at his side, the message was clear: he would rise again, just as seeds sprout after rain. Historians still argue whether Mayan tomb offerings were meant to literally ensure reincarnation or simply symbolize continuity through family and legacy. Was the king expected to return, or was his rebirth more poetic, through his children, his crops, his people's memory? Either way, the seed imagery holds strong. Here's a quirky tidbit. Archaeologists once discovered cacao residues inside funerary vessels shaped like gourds, with glyphs describing them as the food of the gods. Some scholars think the vessels weren't just drink containers but metaphors for wombs, the beans inside symbolizing unborn life. That means your cacao latte isn't just a pick-me-up. In Mayan thought, it might have been a metaphor for sipping the essence of rebirth itself. Comforting or creepy? You decide. The murals echo this theme. You tilt your torch higher, and there it is, a painted tree whose branches spiral like the Milky Way, cacao pods dangling like stars. At its roots, skeletal figures rise, bones turning to flesh, as though drinking in the power of the tree. It's a resurrection scene disguised as botany, and you can't help but shiver. Imagine the funeral again. Priests chanting, women scattering flower petals, attendants carefully placing beans along the king's body. Each one a seed, each one a wish. The people weren't just mourning, they were planting him. Just as farmers press beans into soil, they pressed Cacao into his tomb, confident he'd sprout in another world. You run your fingers along the floor and picture the jungle outside, where cacao trees still grow, leaves whispering in the breeze. In that rustle, you can almost hear the same promise of renewal, the endless cycle that the Maya saw mirrored in their crops. And here's where the humor bubbles up. Imagine explaining this idea at your local coffee shop. "Yes, I'll take a large iced mocha, rebirth on the side, please." Your barista would just blink. But for the Maya, that's exactly what the beans carried. So you sit in the quiet tomb, surrounded by cracked shells and painted trees, and the symbolism hums around you like a low drumbeat. Seeds don't die. They rest, they wait, they rise again. And with Cacao at his side, the king wasn't going into darkness empty-handed, he was going in as a seed himself, destined to sprout among the stars. The torchlight flickers across another stretch of wall, and this time you stop dead in your tracks. Painted there is a cacao tree in full bloom, branches twisting like veins of the sky, pods hanging heavy and golden. It almost glows in the dark chamber, as if the artist mixed in actual sunlight with their pigments. Around the trunk slink jaguars, their green eyes sharp even after centuries, and above the branches perch celestial birds, feathers spread like rainbows frozen in mid-flight. Mainstream fact: cacao trees appear often in Mayan tomb art, not as background scenery but as central figures. They symbolized both earthly sustenance and divine connection, bridging the ground and the heavens. For a king, having those trees painted around his eternal bed was like being wrapped in a living, cosmic orchard. You tilt your torch closer, and the details shimmer. Some of the pods are cracked open, painted seeds spilling out like tiny jewels. The message is loud and clear: abundance follows him, even in death. He doesn't rot in darkness, he grows, feeds, and thrives. The beans scattered on the floor are the real-world echoes of the trees painted on the walls, as though art and object are conspiring to keep him alive. Historians still argue whether these murals were meant as literal maps to the afterlife or symbolic assurances. Did the king believe he'd walk among painted cacao trees in some otherworldly orchard, plucking pods for eternal feasts? Or were the paintings simply reminders to his people that their ruler had carried abundance with him beyond the grave? The debate lingers like the torch smoke curling above your head. Here's a quirky tidbit: in some tombs, cacao pods are painted alongside human hearts, their shapes deliberately similar. To the Maya, both were vessels of life force. So when you see a cacao pod dangling from a tree in a mural, you might actually be looking at a cosmic heart, beating silently in pigment. It makes you glance at the wall with fresh eyes, half expecting it to pulse. The birds above the tree catch your attention next. Their feathers shimmer in blue and green mineral paint, still bright despite centuries of tomb dust. These aren't just any birds, they're quetzals, sacred creatures whose tail feathers were so precious they were reserved for royalty. By perching them in the cacao tree, the artist made the connection unmistakable. This wasn't an ordinary orchard. It was a heavenly grove, guarded by divine animals, crowned by kingship itself. You lean back, and for a moment you imagine stepping into the mural itself. The air would be thick with the smell of ripe pods, the flutter of birds overhead, the low growl of jaguars at your side. And right at the center would be the king, seated beneath the branches, a vessel of frothy cacao in hand, ruling both the living and the dead. It almost makes you laugh. Modern tombs tend to have marble slabs, maybe a bouquet of plastic flowers. This king got an eternal cacao forest, complete with wildlife. Talk about a luxury suite in the afterlife. You trace the outlines of the pods with your eyes, and you realize something: the mural isn't flat. The pods swell, the jaguars crouch, the birds tilt their heads. The artist wanted this orchard to feel alive, so that the king, lying in his wrappings, would never feel alone. He'd be surrounded by guardians, feasts, and symbols of eternal life. And you, intruding centuries later, feel it too. The tomb breathes around you. The cacao trees whisper, the jaguars prowl in silence, the birds spread their wings. The king is gone, but the orchard remains, shimmering in stone and paint, carrying him forward into forever. Your torch sputters as you pass deeper into the chamber, and the glow picks out piles of grave goods arranged with meticulous care. At first, you catch flashes of green jade, polished beads that still gleam like drops of river water. Next to them, obsidian blades shimmer with sharp edges, blacker than midnight, waiting as though they could still cut air itself. And right among them, nestled almost casually, lie handfuls of cacao beans. It makes you pause. Jade, obsidian, shells carried from distant coasts, those were the heavy hitters of wealth and power. They were rare, dangerous to obtain, traded over hundreds of miles. And yet here are beans, fragile, earthy, perishable, tucked in as equals. That says more than words ever could. For the Maya, cacao wasn't just a humble crop. In the hierarchy of offerings, it stood shoulder to shoulder with gemstones and volcanic glass. Mainstream fact: jade was the most prized material in the Maya world, representing breath, life force, and eternal beauty. Obsidian was no less revered, its razor edges used for ritual bloodletting and sacrifice. To bury these with a king was to give him protection, prestige, and a literal blade of power in the afterlife. So why tuck cacao right alongside? Because beans were more than food, they were spiritual currency and symbols of fertility, wealth, and divine favor. Historians still argue whether the cacao was intended to rival those treasures or to complement them. Was it symbolic parity, this is as precious as jade, or was it practical diversity, like packing multiple credit cards for your eternal journey? The debate hums in the silence as you study the artifacts, torch smoke blurring their edges. Here's a quirky tidbit: archaeologists have found jade beads carved in the shape of cacao pods, little hybrids of wealth and plant. Imagine wearing a necklace where every gem is secretly a bean in disguise. It's a fashion statement and a cosmic pun rolled into one. Clearly, the Maya loved blending the symbolic and the literal until the lines blurred completely. You crouch down, watching how the beans and jewels seem almost to mingle. The green of jade, the black sheen of obsidian, the brown, shriveled cacao, all side by side, like a still life painting arranged by hands long gone. It reminds you of a jewelry box that also contains a favorite candy wrapper, sentimental, valuable, personal. And it strikes you, death didn't erase individuality. The king wasn't just being buried with generic symbols of wealth, he was being buried with things that mattered to his identity. The obsidian spoke to his role as sacrificer and warrior, jade to his eternal status, and cacao to his divine connection and everyday enjoyment. Together, they formed a layered portrait of a man who was never simple, always king, priest, warrior, and dreamer. You imagine the burial again, attendants lowering the bundles into place, priests chanting, the firelight catching on jade beads, sparks reflecting off obsidian, and cacao beans rattling softly as they settled. To those in the room, it wasn't just a pile of stuff, it was a coded language, each item a word in a sentence meant to speak to gods and ancestors. And you, standing centuries later, are still reading it. The humor sneaks up on you. If your tomb were packed today, what would they tuck in alongside jewelry and gadgets? A bag of coffee beans? A stash of potato chips? Maybe your favorite sneakers? The Maya weren't so different, they just had sharper knives and better muralists. The king lies wrapped nearby, surrounded by glitter and beans. Together, they form an afterlife toolkit: hard stone, sharp glass, soft seeds, all balanced. Jade doesn't overshadow cacao, obsidian doesn't eclipse beans. In this tomb, the treasures speak in chorus: power, sacrifice, wealth, renewal. The cacao is no less dazzling than the jewels, and in the silence, you realize that's exactly how the Maya wanted it. The chamber feels alive with silence, as though waiting for someone to break it. You steady your torch and lean toward the center, where traces of ritual hang thick in the air. You picture it now, the night of burial, when priests in jaguar skins and feathered headdresses stood at the tomb's edge, cacao vessels in hand, whispering spells. Mainstream fact: Mayan priests played a crucial role in funerary rites. They chanted, bled, and burned offerings to bridge the human world and the divine. Their voices, low and rhythmic, were thought to guide the soul of the deceased along its perilous afterlife journey. The cacao wasn't just dropped in the tomb like a snack, it was ritually spoken over, transformed by words before becoming eternal currency. You close your eyes and imagine the cadence, syllables rolling like waves, glyphs come alive in sound. The smoke of burning copal incense curls upward, mingling with the bitter, earthy aroma of freshly ground cacao. In that darkness, the priest's words and the beans themselves fused into one offering. Historians still argue whether these incantations were meant to animate the cacao, turning beans into living guides, or simply to dedicate them as sacred. Did the priests believe the beans could literally walk beside the king's spirit, or were they tokens carried into a symbolic journey? Either way, the act of whispering over them gave them weight beyond their natural shell. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some spells involved blowing cacao powder into the air, letting it scatter like dust motes that shimmered in torchlight. Think of it as divine confetti, carrying prayers upward. Imagine being the servant tasked with sweeping it up afterward, eternal glitter stuck in every corner. Your torch sputters, and in the flicker you see glyphs painted across a wall panel, curving lines, dots, jagged marks. Some scholars suggest these aren't just decorative inscriptions, but the very words of incantations preserved in pigment. They read like frozen chants, a silent choir still echoing after centuries. You run your fingers along them and half expect to feel a vibration, the hum of spells not quite finished. You lean closer, and it's easy to picture the king's family watching, hushed, as the priests performed their work. The air heavy with smoke, the sharp taste of ash on the tongue, the rhythmic sound of grinding stones preparing one last batch of cacao for ritual. Then, as the vessel was placed at his side, the final words were whispered, binding beans, king, and gods in a single breath. And here's where humor sneaks in. Imagine if modern funerals had priests whispering over Starbucks cups. Grande latte for the road, with extra foam, blessed be thy caffeine. You'd never drink your coffee the same way again. But in this tomb, the seriousness is undeniable. The whispered words elevated simple seeds into spiritual passports. Without those chants, the king's journey might stall. With them, he walked armed, shielded by syllables and beans alike. As you stand in the hush, the torchlight flickering, you can almost hear the echo of those voices, the low, steady rhythm of priests murmuring into the night, their whispers braided with smoke, weaving the king's path toward eternity. The chamber feels quieter now, almost reverent, and you imagine the living gathering outside, offering up their own gestures for the king. Not in person, of course, he's already in his tomb, but through the rituals and the food they left behind. And cacao was at the center of those offerings. You can almost see a long stone table laden with jars, beans, and small cakes, arranged carefully for the spirits to consume. Mainstream fact: the Maya practiced ancestor veneration extensively. Families would bring food, drink, and small gifts to tombs, believing that these offerings nourished their departed relatives and maintained cosmic balance. Cacao, because it was sacred and valuable, often featured prominently. A frothy, bitter drink might be poured into ceremonial vessels, a spiritual feast shared between the living and the dead. You picture the family members, carefully holding cups of liquid cacao, murmuring blessings, and waiting for the king's spirit to drink. Maybe they whispered his favorite flavors, sprinkled chili or honey, or swirled the liquid into intricate foam patterns. In a way, they were hosting a party for someone who couldn't RSVP, ensuring he felt remembered, cherished, and properly caffeinated, if you think about it. Historians still argue whether the offerings were meant to satiate the dead literally or symbolically. Did the king's spirit drink from the cups, or was the ritual act itself sufficient? Either way, the communal gesture reinforced bonds across realms, linking the living and the dead through taste, scent, and ceremony. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some rituals included elaborate chocolate mock battles, where priests or relatives would pour cacao in patterns representing struggles or victories in the afterlife. Imagine using your latte foam to enact epic battles, barista wars, with cinnamon dust for explosions. Slightly silly? Yes. Spiritually meaningful? Absolutely. The murals seem to echo these practices. Painted figures lift vessels, their faces serene, eyes closed in contemplation, mirroring the real-world offerings at the tomb's entrance. The king's cacao was no longer just a personal provision, it had become a bridge connecting generations. The living maintained his presence, and the dead maintained the sacred authority that shaped society. You crouch near a vessel, tracing the remnants of frothy residue, imagining the warm, bitter drink once swirling inside. Perhaps it was spiced, perhaps not, but the smell of roasted beans seems to cling to the ceramic even now, centuries later. You almost think you can taste the bitterness, the faint whisper of honey or chili, like a ghost latte from another era. And the humor sneaks back in. Picture the relatives arguing over how much foam is acceptable for a spirit. Too much chili. He'll never forgive us. In a way, it humanizes them, makes the ceremony less alien. Ancestors and caffeine, temper and sweetness, all mingling in the same ritual cup. As you stand and look around the chamber, the lesson hits. Cacao wasn't just a king's drink. It was a tool for connection, for memory, for maintaining the invisible ties between living and dead. Each sip, or imagined sip, linked worlds, proving that even in eternity, some rituals never lose their flavor. Your torchlight flickers across the murals again, and suddenly the chamber feels larger, stretching beyond the stone walls. You can almost see the pathways the Maya imagined beyond death, twisting rivers and jaguar-infested forests, stars spinning like celestial cacao pods overhead. The king wasn't just lying in darkness, he was embarking on a journey, and cacao was his essential travel companion. Mainstream fact: Maya cosmology envisioned a complex afterlife, with the soul navigating obstacles, trials, and deities before reaching paradise. The underworld, Xibalba, was dangerous. Lords of death awaited, often testing the soul with puzzles or ordeals. Cacao, both sacred and practical, provided spiritual sustenance for these journeys. A cup in life was a cup in death, its significance carried across realms. Historians still argue whether cacao's role in these journeys was symbolic guidance or actual spiritual nourishment. Did the Maya believe the king's spirit would sip the drink and regain strength? Or was it a ritual placeholder, reminding the living of the king's elevated status? Either way, the beans and vessels weren't mere decoration, they were essential navigational tools for the afterlife. Here's a quirky tidbit: some glyphs suggest cacao was even considered a passport for the soul. Imagine crossing the afterlife with a tiny bag of chocolate beans, each one stamped with cosmic authority. Lose your beans, and the gates might not open. Modern travelers fret over passports and boarding passes. The Maya packed cacao. Same principle, different flavor. You step closer to a mural depicting a king with a vessel in hand, ascending a stairway of stars. The froth of his drink curls upward, mingling with painted clouds. It's like the artist wanted to show motion, the sense of rising, floating, and ascending through perilous terrain. The king isn't stationary, he's active, navigating realms that are as challenging as they are majestic. You imagine the journey itself. Each step might require cunning, courage, and perhaps a sip of cacao to steady the nerves. The beans might serve as currency for supernatural gatekeepers or fuel to energize the spirit during its trials. The imagery tells you the Maya believed life and death were intertwined adventures, with cacao as a companion, guide, and reward. And humor creeps in again. Picture a soul at a checkpoint in the afterlife. "Do you have your cacao, sir?" asks a skeletal guard. "I left it in my other tomb." Disaster. Luckily, the king's careful burial ensured he never forgot. The murals also show small animals and birds alongside him, almost like assistants or spirit guides, emphasizing that the journey wasn't solo. Cacao isn't just liquid here, it's part of an ecosystem of guidance, nourishment, and protection. Every sip reinforces authority, courage, and connection to the divine. You breathe slowly, torchlight shaking, and realize that the beans, the vessels, and the murals together form a map, a multisensory roadmap for eternity. The king is prepared, armed with drink, wisdom, and cosmic support. He is ready to move through darkness, to face challenges, and to emerge into celestial realms, cacao in hand, froth clinging to his lip, unafraid. You shift your gaze toward a corner of the tomb where the light struggles to reach, and suddenly you picture a very different audience, the Spanish conquistadors who stumbled into Cacao centuries later. You can almost hear their grimaces, their disbelief, their attempts to understand the Maya obsession with this bitter, frothy drink. They were used to sugar-laden European concoctions and instead found a ritual beverage that tasted like roasted earth and a hint of chili. It wasn't a dessert, it was a cultural revelation, and a confusing one at that. Mainstream fact: when Hernan Cortés and his men arrived in Mesoamerica, they encountered cacao primarily as a drink, often mixed with water, chili, and spices. The Spaniards initially found it bitter, unpalatable, and sometimes even disgusting. They didn't realize that for the Maya, cacao wasn't just about taste, it was power, spirituality, and status. It was ceremonial, functional, and intertwined with kingship. Historians still argue whether the Spaniards' disdain shaped their later colonial policies around cacao. Did they miss the spiritual significance entirely, or did they purposely reduce it to a commodity once they understood its economic value? Either way, their misunderstanding adds a layer of irony centuries later as we uncover these tombs and artifacts, seeing just how seriously the Maya took their chocolate. Here's a quirky tidbit. One Spanish chronicler described cacao foam as a disgusting froth, thick and vile, yet he admitted that nobles seemed to derive vigor and courage from it. Imagine sipping something you hate, while everyone around you swears its divine energy. That's cultural dissonance at its finest. You glance at the murals, picturing the king reclining with his frothy cup, and laugh quietly to yourself. The Spaniards probably imagined he was drinking some unpleasant porridge, unaware that each sip was a spiritual act, a ritual reinforcement of authority, and a connection to both ancestors and gods. The irony is thick enough to pour over a ceramic cup. And it gets funnier. Some conquistadors tried to replicate the drink with European methods, adding sugar and cinnamon, completely missing the point. It's like trying to recreate a perfume by mixing vanilla and motor oil. Not quite the same, but their attempts eventually led to modern chocolate, sweeter, tamer, and far from the sacred experience the Maya intended. The beans in the tomb, you realize, represent a cultural continuity the Spaniards couldn't erase. They survived centuries of misunderstanding, conquest, and taste adaptation. Every pod, every mural, every residue of frothy drink speaks to a tradition that persisted long before colonial interference. You crouch over a broken vessel, imagining that the king's final sip remained untouched by European hands. Bitter, spiced, sacred, this was his private indulgence, a ceremonial affirmation of power, wealth, and divine favor. And centuries later, you are tasting it through memory, imagination, and the silent testimony of the tomb. The contrast is striking. Spanish confusion on one hand, Maya precision on the other. And here you are, centuries removed, walking the line between them, marveling at how sacred beans could survive conquest, colonization, and the eventual global obsession with chocolate. You step carefully over the scattered beans, moving toward a section of the tomb where modern excavation tools have left faint impressions in the dust. Archaeologists have been here, and you can almost see them crouched over the broken pottery, brushes in hand, eyes wide with excitement. This is where the past meets the present, where centuries-old cacao secrets are uncovered, studied, and marveled at by scientists in lab coats rather than priests in feathered headdresses. Mainstream fact: modern tomb excavations frequently reveal chemical traces of cacao in pottery, confirming what the murals and texts hinted at. Even 1,000 years later, residue tests can detect theobromine, the key compound in cacao, proving that these vessels once held sacred drinks. Archaeologists can piece together preparation methods, spicing traditions, and even ceremonial purposes, bringing life back to what had been long buried. Historians still argue how much of this can be confidently interpreted. Can residue alone tell us whether the cacao was meant for daily ritual, special ceremonies, or the afterlife journey? Did the vessels hold personal drinks for the king, or were they offerings to accompany him? Either way, the science enriches the story, adding texture and credibility to what once seemed like legend. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some tombs, chemical analysis has revealed traces of chili, honey, and maize mixed with cacao, mirroring what ancient murals suggest. Scientists have effectively reconstructed recipes from ghost flavors. Imagine sipping a 1,200-year-old chocolate concoction in your mind, bitter, spiced, earthy, with a hint of sweetness, a time travel latte prepared by ancestors long gone. You crouch beside a ceramic cup, running your fingers over the smooth rim, imagining the craftsman's hands painting intricate designs while grinding beans into paste. The more you look, the more the artistry stands out: tiny hieroglyphs, miniature cacao pods, and subtle depictions of rituals frozen in paint. Each detail whispers about the ceremonial care poured into these drinks. And humor creeps in again. You can almost hear a modern archaeologist muttering, "Yep, definitely chocolate. Definitely spiritual. Definitely ancient Starbucks." The idea of lab coats trying to reconstruct spiritual beverages is oddly charming. You notice how even broken vessels can tell stories. Residue patterns indicate where the froth might have been thickest, glyphs hint at ceremonial intent, and bin placement within tombs reveals their dual role as sustenance and currency. The king's afterlife experience is mapped not just in murals but in tangible chemical traces, bridging centuries in an invisible dialogue. Standing back, you imagine archaeologists gently brushing away dust, marveling at beans that survived conquest, decay, and time. The king's ceremonial cacao endures, revealing ritual, status, and continuity. The beans were small, humble, and sacred, but through science, they speak loudly, telling stories you can almost taste and hear. You rise from the dusty floor and step toward the far end of the tomb, where a cluster of painted glyphs seems to shimmer even in the weak torchlight. These symbols, curling like vines around cacao pods, are almost hypnotic. You feel a strange reverence, as though the walls themselves are whispering the secrets of the king's journey. Mainstream fact: glyphs were a cornerstone of Maya communication, combining logograms and syllables to convey names, events, and religious ideas. In tombs, inscriptions often recorded lineage, deeds, and ritual prescriptions, including how to care for the deceased in the afterlife. Cacao frequently appears in these glyphs, emphasizing its ritual importance and marking it as a critical companion for kings beyond death. Historians still argue how literally to interpret these glyphs. Were they practical instructions for caretakers, symbolic reminders for the living, or magical commands for the dead? Perhaps all three. Either way, the combination of beans, murals, and glyphs demonstrates that the Maya envisioned a thoroughly prepared afterlife. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some glyphs include cacao pods anthropomorphized, with tiny faces or limbs, as if the beans themselves were sentient companions to the king. Imagine cartoon cacao beans scurrying beside you on a cosmic journey, slightly whimsical, but full of spiritual meaning. The murals and glyphs together create a layered narrative. Pods are painted spilling open, showing seeds like stars, birds perch above, jaguars prowl below, and the inscriptions name and bless each element. It's as if the king is wrapped not only in cloth but in a living story, every detail designed to ensure he remains powerful, nourished, and protected for eternity. You crouch, torch in hand, tracing the lines with your eyes. Even centuries later, the Maya message comes through: cacao is more than food or money. It is vitality, connection, and immortality. Without it, the king's journey could falter. With it, he is armed with nourishment, prestige, and spiritual fuel. And humor creeps back in. Picture the king entering the afterlife, beans bouncing in his hands, Quetzals glancing disapprovingly at his foam-stained robe. Even in eternity, a little decorum is required. You imagine the burial again, priests reciting incantations, attendants placing jars, beans scattered strategically, murals and glyphs guiding the process. Each element reinforces the others, creating a multisensory, multidimensional preparation for eternity. It becomes clear that every layer, the beans, the froth, the jars, the glyphs, the murals, works in concert. Together, they compose a ritual symphony, ensuring the king's journey is secure, sanctified, and celebrated. And for a visitor like you, centuries later, it's both humbling and awe-inspiring to witness how a humble bin could carry so much meaning. You step back, torch in hand, taking in the full expanse of the tomb. The walls are alive with murals, the floor scattered with cacao beans, and vessels stand silent but potent witnesses to centuries of ritual. It hits you, every detail, every pod, every brushstroke was designed to ensure the king's journey beyond death was as rich and potent as his reign in life. Mainstream fact: Mayan kings were often buried with elaborate offerings, including jade, obsidian, food, and ceremonial vessels. These grave goods symbolized status, power, and the essential sustenance needed for the afterlife. Among all of these treasures, cacao beans were uniquely significant, functioning as currency, sacred drink, and spiritual sustenance simultaneously. Historians still argue how much of this was literal preparation versus symbolic ritual. Did the beans physically nourish the king's spirit, or were they an eternal emblem of wealth and divine favor? Likely both. Either way, the beans' presence underscores their centrality to royal identity and afterlife belief. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some tombs, archaeologists have found miniature grinding stones alongside cacao vessels, suggesting that the king might have been expected to prepare his own drink in the afterlife. Imagine an eternal espresso machine hidden among the jade and obsidian. The Maya clearly combined practicality with profound ritual imagination. You imagine the final burial ceremony, torches flickering, incense curling in the cool night air. Priests chant over vessels of frothy cacao, scattering beans, placing jars with precision, reciting glyphic invocations. Every movement, every whisper, every drop of the sacred drink was an orchestrated act to ensure the king's successful transition into the underworld. The ritual itself was a bridge, connecting life and death, human and divine, physical and spiritual. The murals seem to shimmer as you look across the tomb. Jaguars crouch like silent guardians, quetzals perch in eternal vigilance, and cacao pods dangle like ornaments of abundance. Even after centuries, you can feel the intended effect, awe, reverence, and the subtle reminder that this king, though dead, is still fully present, still empowered, still tasting the sacred brew. And humor seeps in one last time. The king, lying in his tomb, surrounded by beans, jars, and mystical inscriptions, could probably roll his eyes at your flashlight, but he'd likely approve of your curiosity. After all, anyone who appreciates cacao in life and death is a kindred spirit. You stand quietly, absorbing the symbolism, imagining the ceremonies, tasting the spiritual froth, and recognizing the continuity of culture and belief. The beans, the vessels, the murals, the glyphs, they are all pieces of a meticulous, layered story. And at its heart is the message that cacao was never just a crop, it was a conduit, a companion, a currency, and a cosmic connector, ensuring the king's immortality. Now, as your torchlight dims and the shadows settle, take a deep breath and let your mind drift. The tomb is still, yet alive with centuries of memory, the ghosts of chants, the faint aroma of roasted beans, the echoes of footsteps and ceremonial drums. Imagine the king resting, his vessels of cacao by his side, murals surrounding him, glyphs guiding his path, and jaguars and quetzals watching over every step. Relax into the quiet rhythm of this ancient place. Let the imagery of cacao beans, frothy vessels, and painted trees float softly through your mind. The power, ritual, and reverence that once surrounded a single human life are now gentle echoes, brushing against your awareness without urgency or alarm. Each element, the beans, the murals, the glyphs, folds seamlessly into the next, creating a tapestry of continuity, comfort, and cosmic order. Feel your own breath slow, in time with the imagined chants of the priests, the rustle of painted leaves, and the soft froth rising in ceremonial vessels. The king's journey is complete, and you, too, are at ease. There is no hurry, no danger, only the quiet reverence of history settling like a soft blanket. Now, let the tomb fade gently from your vision. The beans, the murals, the froth, the glyphs, they remain eternal, but you return to your own world, carrying a whisper of the sacred with you. Let the thought of Cacao, both humble and divine, linger like a faint, comforting aroma, reminding you of cycles, rituals, and the enduring connection between life, death, and memory.